Thanks so much, Ahmed, and great job. This is such a great event. It's so great to be here. Hi, Manav.
Hi, and thank you, Emma, as well. Very nice to be here. Thanks for having us.
So it's been kind of a crazy couple of years in alt protein, Manav. I mean, do you remember when you organized the first kind of the announcement of your first that you were going to launch the food tech program with Josh from Eat Just? And I mean, that felt like such a revolution, you know? And at the time, I think there was only Carrie and maybe Sandia that were really well known in Asia in terms of cellular agriculture companies, as well as Hanyu from Integriculture in Japan. But that was really it. It felt like so far away from where we are now, right?
It feels like another world. We've gone through so many changes, not just in Hong Kong, not just in this industry, but also around the world. So yeah, it definitely feels like forever ago. And same for you guys too. You've done such an incredible job just in the last few years, you know, truly dominating the kind of information space and media space in this category. And none of that was there, you know, just a couple of years ago either.
Yeah, I mean, also thanks to, you know, support from Brinc and other awesome ecosystem partners. I think, you know, there were very few stories to tell, and it was sort of a bit, you know, what role is Asia going to play in this industry? And then suddenly it just all happened, and suddenly it made sense that, you know, here we are in the most populous region in the world, all 60% of the world's population, huge amount of increase in protein consumption coming from this part of the world. The idea of food security, I think that's when it really kind of crystallized for me, is the idea that in Asia we have very different considerations around food security and food safety, which are were not as present in the West in the same way. I think now that's all changed with COVID and wars and inflation and supply chain disruption. But a few years ago, it really felt like, okay, what is Asia going to do to really secure its future food supply? And of course, you know, we're talking about 4 years ago, Singapore had not announced its 30 by 2030 yet. And we didn't have all that happening. But I mean, what was it for you? When was the moment where you thought, wow, okay, you know, cellular agriculture could really play a huge role for the region? And what were some of like the early companies that you really had looked at and thought, wow, this is some pioneering stuff?
I think for us, when we first started, we were just very impressed by the work that Just was doing. I remember going to a conference that was organized by David. I think it was called Green.
Yes, I was there. Yeah. The
We were all there.
Forum, the Green Forum.
And
yeah.
David had brought in, you know, as a true kind of, you know, pioneer in the space in the early days, well before all of us kind of entered, and all the work he was doing with Green Monday, had set up this incredible conference where he'd brought in so many great investors and speakers from the US. He'd brought in so many great stakeholders. And I started, after attending that, just recognizing how much potential there was in taking some of the building blocks that had already started in the West and bringing them back into Asia, and recognizing that for the first time, I think in our history at Brinc, I could pursue not only the work we like to do, but the work that was very important. Because for us, we always believed that we could solve some of the world's largest problems, backing entrepreneurs. We entered categories where we thought there was white space, where we thought there was opportunities to enable and empower founders in accelerating their ability to bring products and services to market. Just never recognized how much true innovation had already begun in the food tech space, what food tech even was at that moment. You know, many years ago, you know, this was a spin out of bio. It was a spin out of you know, different technologies that was then getting reapplied. And Josh had done a great job, obviously evangelizing, really talking through the problem set, talking about what the opportunities were. And I think for us, we started to also realize that countries that were traditionally importing most of their food just would not be able to continue to do that long term. They had to think about how they could get and attain food security, how they could produce more domestically. I think we started spending more time looking at food and the makeup of these foods, and realized that they were just inefficient, highly resource heavy, and that the future foods would be manufactured anywhere. And that as we invested in plant-based or cell-based, we'd have the opportunities to use new cultivation techniques, vertical farming, and kind of layer out and manage climate conditions, which were a real issue. So I think we just saw a lot of the macro factors coming together, and we saw the writing was on the wall. So we said it was a good time to see what we could do about it, and started investing in some early companies. And a lot of them have grown, and they've been great contributors to the ecosystem. And it's so great to see the entire ecosystem in Asia grow over the last few years.
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely been, and especially with COVID, the last 2 years, everything's come together. There's such an explosion of new startups. There's some really interesting markets. Korea is one that I think is really underrated on the global stage, but one to watch, where a lot of the startups, are doing really interesting stuff with much smaller runways and budgets, with just a lot less funding and backing. I think China is something we should probably talk about too. I think that for me, I did a whole podcast about this on the topic of China, and obviously things have really changed in the last 2 months specifically. But earlier on the year, when I was recording this podcast about China and alt protein, I have to say that my thoughts were that it had kind of surprised me that China had not taken more of a lead over the last 2 years in this space, just because one of the big issues for China is definitely going to be food security and just like controlling the imported food supply. And so given that it's, a young population full of talent, lots of really good engineering and biotech universities, why not kind of, support this industry just and be one of the leaders? But even in my conversations with some founders in cellular ag founders in China, I understood that their view was that the government was taking more of a wait and see approach, even with regards to regulation. But I would have expected that there would have been more cell ag companies in China. There's only around 5, I think, maybe 6 with a new one, but that's very little.
It is. What happened over the last 2 months? Because I've been off grid as well. So maybe for my benefit and for the rest of the group, what's happened in the last couple months?
So I recorded this in January, and then the podcast actually went live a few weeks ago, and I had to tell the fellow that he needed to make a note, because what really happened is after 2 years of really not having much of a comment on alternative proteins, alternative proteins were mentioned in the China 5-year ag plan. And then also President Xi gave a speech where he actually called out alternative proteins and specifically cellular agricultural meat. And so that has really kind of, people have gotten very, very excited about that, naturally. I still think that it's early days, given just what's happened over the last 2 years, but obviously now there's a bit of a nod to the industry. It's been mentioned by name, which is just taken to be a big sign of things. But I still maintain that, even despite all of these things that I'm mentioning, I feel there should be more cell-based startups in China.
Absolutely. 2 of our teams, CellX and Avant, just recently were part of they helped set up the China Cellular Agricultural Forum, basically to help support kind of committees and groups that would work towards creating more regulatory awareness, supporting, pushing legislation forward, and hopefully, I think, getting more infrastructure and funding from the government. Definitely an area I think that's very, very critical for China's long term, not only in terms of their own domestic food security, but also as an opportunity for them from exports and manufacturing perspective. And I was just reading, one of the things that came out of that from one of the food law experts Wolford found. He was mentioning that there's 4 main regulatory areas that they want to work on. Nomenclature, which I think is obviously very important. So we have clear, guidelines in terms of how this stuff is framed. Categorization of the products, data requirements, as well as protocols for pre-market clearance and consensus across industry kind of best practices. And I think that's really important because, just using those as a baseline, I think Singapore's done such a good job of, on a case-by-case basis, approving various companies. It's still not kind of a blanket approval, right? It still has to kind of go through case-by-case approval, but I don't know why governments can't share some of those learnings, some of their policies, some of the R&D, some of the work that they've done, and help other countries also pick up and adopt similar policies and improve the regulatory frameworks. If they've already done the research, they've already asked the tough questions, they've gone through the process, there's obviously a lot of overlap, I think, in the way one government or another one would want to look at this. So, I think everyone's still kind of looking at each other and looking at where, some examples may emerge. And there's obviously countries that are pushing the boundaries, but I'd love to see, China pave the way, Singapore pave the way, and perhaps also share some of their guidance in terms of why they've made decisions to do this. Maybe even a global council that involves, not just folks in the industry, in the country, but perhaps on a broader scale.
Yeah, actually, there's been some attacks on in the US on the fact that sell new novel foods, including for precision fermentation and cellular agriculture, are under the remit of only one person at the USDA, and he actually doesn't have a long-term experience that is kind of like directly relevant. And so I think we're going to see this issue a lot. And I think all of these industry associations, and so there's the China Forum that just happened. There's an APAC association that was just formed, which included companies from across the region, plus Israel as well, including Israel. There's, I think, an alliance that just happened, or in Europe, there's the beginnings of an alliance. There's a lot of kind of country-specific ones like Cellular Agriculture France, and a lot of activity, obviously, in the Netherlands. And the Dutch government did give a nod with like 60 million for investment in this industry. So you see that there are a lot of companies, right? We're at about 100 odd companies now globally in cell ag. I'm not counting precision fermentation and all the plant-based, right? And there's industry associations, there's kind of ecosystem players. But for me, what I think is really missing is that link between the industry and mass consumers. And I feel like we're not bridging that gap, because you mentioned nomenclature, right? And labeling. And that is directly relevant to a consumer. And it is going to hugely impact the first product that comes out, how it's named, how it's labeled, is going to directly impact the early success of these players and these products. And a lot of the investment dollars are going into the R&D, and there's just not enough investment in education, awareness, kind of even marketing to some extent, or really helping people understand what this is, because there is this, and this is true of the greater alt protein movement and industry, but there is a growing divide between the people that are pro food tech and anti food tech when it comes to discussing the future of food.
Absolutely. And I think one kind of interesting thing for us to also think about is, the West, Europe and the US have spent so much money and time on branding, on framing, on the kind of nomenclature in essence. And obviously there's incredible pickup in vegetarianism, veganism, and flexitarianism. I think, however, as we kind of draw, learn from that and look at Asia, we need to think about this differently, because meat consumption is still up, right? And it's up year after year after year. So that means that everything that is happening and that we are learning from the West, we need to think about that in the sense that people are still looking for, meat. And as more people in Asia improve their social economic conditions, we need to, I think, invest heavier dollars on infrastructure and policies and other enabling services and products that can help founders kind of leapfrog the approach perhaps taken in the West, in Asia. I always, I look at India and say, if we went in and if India was trying to solve its problems of traffic, right, and it designed roads just like the US did, eventually those roads would get clogged up, right? What they really need to be investing in is a flying car, for example, right? So what's the equivalent in this industry? And it really is cell-based, right? And it's investing in the infrastructure, the policies, and also investing perhaps money in education and skill development for those who will be displaced or potentially will be displaced as the industries shift and move to kind of higher tech categories. So I think there's a lot to do. And there's, it's all still open. So I think there's been incredible strides, but there's still so much more scope. And it's exciting because as founders, there's just so many areas to get to work on. Sonalie, for you guys, how did you get, super excited about this and decide that, it was time to go all in on all protein with your news, with your reporting, with your EDMs, with industry reports? What was the driver for you?
Yeah, no, I love that question. So what happened was Green Queen was becoming more news centric and really looking at what can people be doing in their daily lives to have a healthier but also more sustainable life. And a lot of the conversation was around food. And of course, that's because I'm very food centric, but also because there was just more and more information coming out linking food emissions and climate change. And so once that was really realized in my mind, I felt that as the editor-in-chief, my job is to curate the content, right? So my job is to make sure that what we're writing about is directly linked to our mission, right? Which is to, really advocate for societal and societal change for the environment, because basically our thesis is the climate crisis is an emergency. It's the biggest crisis of our time. And so what can we do at Green Queen so that our readers can feel informed about what's going on and we're spending all this time talking about energy, we're spending all this time talking about plastic, but we're not spending enough time changing what's on our plate. And it felt like, especially in Asia, that discussion just wasn't happening. And I was able to be at food and trade shows all around the world because of my other business, Eco Warehouse. And I was being introduced to companies like Eat Just or Beyond Meat. And I was really feeling how different they were. For me, they represented a seismic shift compared to other food companies that were just, let's say, making delicious tofu bites. I feel like these companies were saying, no, hang on, we're going to make meat, or we're going to make prawns, or we're going to make crab cakes, or we're going to make eggs, but we're going to do it from plants. But essentially it was this kind of mind twist where it was like, this is meat. It's just not made using an animal. And that was very different than saying, oh, we've got plant-based foods that vegans would love. This was like, actually, we're going to go see the meat eater or the seafood lover or the cheese lover, and we're going to give them what they want. We're just not going to include an animal. And so that is when I really felt like, okay, there are these companies that are really just, yeah, they're disrupting. They're a revolution. So I wrote this article. It was back in 2016 where I profiled the 6 companies that I had come across, as well as New Harvest, which is obviously more of an organization, but it was New Wave, right, with the shrimp. It was Hampton Creek, now Eat Just, right, with the egg. It was Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, Memphis Meats, which is now Upside Foods. And I basically was like, this is here's the revolution. And after that, I just got interested in all the, and tracking all those companies. And then I was very close with Jenny at Green Monday, and I knew that, she would share with me that they were working on their own. They had realized that their Green Monday movement wasn't enough. They needed to give people solutions. And they had realized that, oh, the solutions that exist, like Beyond Meat and Impossible, they're great, but they're not tailored to Asians or Chinese diets here in Hong Kong. And so they were saying, we're going to create those solutions. And that's when I kind of thought, okay, this is a sea change here. And we need to be the ones to tell the story of these solutions to the world, because the coverage, and it was very early then, so there was very little coverage, but it was very Eurocentric, very US centric. And as with a lot of things that we do at Green Queen, we're like, okay, well, we're going to tell the global story with an Asian framing. And we're going to really, really be the place where you can come and find out about Omnipork, not just Beyond Meat, right? And so that's where it started. And that involved all the ultra. And at that time, when I first wrote that article, the term alt protein didn't exist. Food tech wasn't really there. I think somebody clever was like, I'm going to add tech to food, and then all of these people are going to throw money at this industry, and all these bros are going to get into it, because it's, when food is just food, it feels very kind of domestic. And when it's food tech, obviously, it comes with a lot more somehow pedigree from as an investment category. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about food tech. I was thinking, wow, the majority of our emissions are from our diets, and specifically from beef and dairy. And beef and dairy curves are going up, and we're going to have more people, and we're going to have more middle class that's going to want more meat, and we're going to need to give them stuff. And actually, the funny thing is, today when I talk on panels, one of the points I'm always making is, hey, this isn't an either or situation. Like, we genuinely do not have enough planet to make enough meat for the rising demand. So even if we just kept going and everyone kept eating as much animal meat, we still are going to have this demand delta. And so we're going to need alternatives anyway, because a lot of the rhetoric is around replacing. But at this point, it's additive. So that's sort of how it happened. And then I just started telling those stories and becoming known for telling those stories. And so people started coming to me, and a lot of the founders, would ask me for advice, like, what should I put in my press release? Who should I write to? What should I do? How do I tell the story? And then we became sort of like the loudspeaker that other media would then come and get the story from us, which still happens today. So that's how.
Oh, it's great. And you guys continue to, I think, find stories of teams well before anyone else does. So it's great to see not only, I guess, Asia representation, but also fairly grassroots representation from so many different countries in the across the kind of media platform. So it's great. And love what you guys are doing. Excited for you to keep doing that. I think it's super important work, because if we don't solve this, as you said, we don't have another planet. We're killing 1 trillion animals a year. And as a lifelong, individual who's never eaten meat in his life, if we do the math that, divide it out, that's still almost 180, 200 animals killed per person. So, if I can't, even on our end, or if we can't on our end, contribute back to, trying to turn that around, it's just crazy. So I think it's a great time to be in the space. I think we're very, very bullish.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think, one of the things that is happening though, as I alluded to earlier, is this kind of the early backlash has started, as it always does, when something is very, very new, and we've got these factions forming. But I think it's really important to just remember how early we really are. Just it's so early, and there's such a big kind of growth curve and opportunity curve ahead of us. So especially for cell based. I mean, to be very frank, my best guesstimate is at least 10, 15 years before this is going to be in a supermarket, right? At price parity. So, I mean, this is really far out. And so we really need that kind of blue ocean thinking, and that kind of let's just dive in and kind of try stuff attitude, you know?
I'm hopeful, and I think we're investing heavily across the category. And I think just going back to, I guess, the spirit of, or the agenda today, which is more around ecosystem development and what more we all can do, and what governments, I guess, can do. I think if we can get the right groups on board to truly get behind this, more government grant funding, more public sector funding, more capital that gets in early as well as late. From an investment perspective, early, late, and growth is all up over year after year after year. But it's still hard for this industry to compete with meat. It's still fractional percentages in terms of the comparison to the overall meat industry. But with the right support and the right capital, I think it's going to pay off exponentially in the long term. I think we have to get to a point where there's consistency in regulation and labeling, consensus over what it's called. We need to work actively with universities and research groups to develop stronger pipelines of R&D. We've seen some incredible teams coming out of universities. We need to figure out how there's more visibility that's provided, and work actively with these universities to hopefully help them recognize that technology and IP that they're sitting on could be incredibly valuable as it's kind of reapplied to this space. I think, as you mentioned, there's huge scope on public campaigns and ultimately not branding this as fake meat, but really a category of its own. On the IP side, maybe just even expanding it out, I think it'd be great to see if we had IP banks, or groups could share learnings and cross-pollinate each other's R&D and development and accelerate their ability to go to market.
Well, I think that's one of the criticisms, Manav, just to, before you keep going, that there isn't enough open source sharing on this.
Yeah, and it's tough, because I know from an investment perspective, as investors, one of the things you look for is moats and defensibility from a tech and IP perspective, right? So you're constantly looking for teams that have a USP, that have defensibility, that are protecting themselves. But at the same time, the bigger and the greater calling here is to see how we could open that up, right? So more can learn from each other, but perhaps gain and align each other through licensing, and or other means. So I think there is a battle perhaps between the investment returns and then the possibility of driving the largest possible impact. And I think there's a fine line there, and the teams that are building moats could also see how they extend their value through other teams and other players in the space that perhaps can gain and move faster as a result of some of their learnings, right? And I think the same thing should happen with governments and all the work that they're doing on the regulation side. I think there should be groups that allow that paving and adoption to share. Labs and facilities, obviously super important. It's great to see Singapore and a few other countries really investing behind this. I think we need a lot more of it. One of the things I'd love to also start seeing is more education at an early age, right? So, how do we get schools to actually start talking about food? I don't think this is happening right now. Like, why isn't this part of curriculum? Why isn't it included more actively at an early age, to help people recognize what is food and, what is sustainable food, or even talk about creating curriculums in universities. Like, that's starting to happen in a few countries. And we obviously love the acceleration space because we think accelerators are a great way to deliver value at scale, work actively with stakeholders, onboard different stakeholders. We'd love to see more programs, more partnerships, more corporates, more mentors, folks from industry that can get more actively involved. But I think we're fairly bullish. I think I think we should be taxing meat, right? If the subsidy's in and we start taxing meat, this will turn, right? It's the same argument that's happening with plastic bags.
And with
right?
EVs.
And with EVs and plastic bags are crazy right now. It's I think they say that we consume 50,000 microplastics a year just from overfishing and from the fishing industry. That's the equivalent of eating a plastic credit card every week. We're literally eating a plastic credit card that's going into our body every single week. And that movement's already shifted. We're investing and policies are shifting to recognize it, perhaps way too slow, but they're getting there, which is great. Why can't the same thing happen quicker? Why can't we learn from that mistake and actually pick it up so we don't have to wait 10 or 15 years? And maybe we can do this in less than 5.
But I think honestly, I'm going to push back here and say that I'm going to put myself out on a limb here. Like, the work that we do at Green Queen is really, really important. And yet we need more funding, right? And there just isn't enough funding for media and for campaigns and for NGO. That we need more NGOs in the space. You're referencing plastic. Well, a lot of plastic activism, has been funded over the last 10 to 20 years. And I don't see that happening as much. Currently, all the dollars are just going into the founders, in the same way that a lot of the dollars are not going into enough of the supporting technology, like scaffolding and serums and bioreactor development. But they're, part of the ecosystem is information sharing, as you said. And, we are who consumers learn this stuff from. And we do things like go and talk to schools and all that, but there just needs to be more funding on getting this message out. Otherwise, for consumers, it remains a very kind of far away, labby kind of, oh, that's Star Trek stuff. That's not on my plate every day. Why should I care stuff? And so I really think that one of the mistakes that I hope we don't make in this space is not putting enough resources and attention to the education and awareness building side, because otherwise you will have pushback. And this needs to happen also with politicians. There are already politicians that are pro alt protein and politicians that are against alt protein, right? And alt protein is very much getting branded as this kind of Silicon Valley techno optimist thing. And you've got all these people in agriculture that are feeling attacked and feeling kind of, put aside, and that's growing louder. And I talk now to founders and ecosystem players in the space that are saying, yeah, this is becoming a bigger issue. And the worst is if those people get their messaging out before we do, then it's much easier to come in as a new idea than it is to come in and battle with a preconceived idea of what something is. And even with journalists, even in the mass media, how many journalists still call it fake meat and lab grown meat, despite so much work from people like the Good Food Institute, who've really worked hard to try and change it to cultivated meat, but based on research that showed that was the term that kind of fits best for consumers and for the industry. So it's a really important time to invest in all the other stuff and not just the tech, because the tech has to be adopted. And the tech has to be regulated by government officials who have to buy into it.
No, I agree with you, and I think it's a balance. I think that from a regulatory perspective, the regulatory groups will obviously be educated, perhaps through the awareness and exposure, but will hopefully be motivated through the revolutionary potential of science and technology and the possibility to truly build sustainable, equitable, inclusive kind of food ecosystems. So I think it's definitely a balance. On our end, we're definitely investing across the spectrum. I can put my hand up and say we haven't invested enough, perhaps in information and awareness, companies, but we have invested in stem lines, stem cell lines. We've invested in, companies like Orbillion Bio that's got a, great throughput and bioprocessing system for cell lines, really focused on diversity and kind of, more of the heritage breeds. We've invested in serum-free media, so looking at how we can get, through umami meats and clear meats, developing exponential kind of cost reductions, which is a huge cost component. We're investing in companies that are doing innovations in bioreactors, in scaffolding, in scaling up the process. So there's I think a wide array of investments happening across the tech stack, from plant to cell to the tools that enable all of it. But I agree with you. I think there's scope on the information awareness side, and I think as an investor, they just have to think through what's the return there, right? Or at the bare minimum, governments and groups that should be funding this type of research and in-depth work, like GFI is doing, like you guys are doing, should be better supported.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I mean, again, consumers we need them to want this as well, because we need them to vote for elected officials that are going to want to do this. And we need to not make the same mistakes that have happened with plastic alternatives. And also with, for example, EVs, it's taken a really long time.
I think though that without government support, it's going to be very tough. Plastics, EVs, have been around, alternate plastics or alternate means for travel and transport, or even electric cars been around for a long time. Without evangelists, without government push, without policy improvement, they just don't get picked up. And I think
absolutely, that's where we can really push. I mean, in many countries, you can really kind of lobby your government official, right, as a consumer.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's a fine balance, right? It depends how we get there, but I think we're all excited about pushing this across different areas. I'm hopeful that a government recognizes the scientific and the cost benefit, and as we continue to invest in technologies that are groundbreaking, they will prove that through science, and go to government and pick up, get adoption, because this is the first time, governments can actually get an edge, and they don't need tremendous amounts of land and resources to actually have an edge on a global playing field. I mean,
so what do you see as some of the biggest challenges going forward?
Challenges in terms
for this industry, like if you had to pick.
Lack of. Yeah, very good question. Lack of infrastructure. So I don't think that there is enough infrastructure right now to permit any semblance of, deep R&D or scale. I think that it's very, very far off. I also think that we are not thinking through the entire supply chain. And I'll use Web3 as an example. Web3 has gotten a very bad name, or blockchain's gotten a very bad name, despite the potential transformatory benefits or potential of the technology, simply because the energy source behind it is not renewable in most cases. And so while the technology, can equitably, enable hundreds of millions of people to get on board in trust-based systems and with consensus and enable true, validation of very important assets. It's just gotten a poor branding, right? And the branding, it's not gotten a poor branding. It's using non-renewable sources of energy in its production. So unless it moves to hydro, unless it moves to renewable, and I think similar for cell-based lines, I don't think we need an infrastructure that's just scalable. We need that infrastructure to be built in a manner that's perhaps using solar, perhaps using, non-conventional energy sources. I think unit economics obviously are still being worked through, but just like any technology that's preceded it, cell phones, cars, iPhones, whatever, we will get there. And it's just a matter of if the subsidies end on the other end, so it becomes more attractive, or there's more incentives for investing in this stack. I think there's definitely also technical and scientific limitations with stem cells, cell adhesion, FBS, still a big issue. I think there's regulatory, inconsistency, and even Singapore, though doing an incredible job, is still approving on a case-by-case basis, right? Which we talked about. So, how do we get to more blanket approval and have at least 1 or 2 countries lead, and think about how, look, they say we are the place you come to launch, and we'll provide you all of the above, and we'll support it. But as you said, super early, lots to do, but also lots of potential.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I don't think we would be here and there would be a whole summit if there wasn't so much potential. I think also kind of just helping, like you talked about universities, I think there's a lot of work to do there. It's very early stages, and there are a few universities in the Netherlands and in Singapore that have, and a couple in the US that have started, having all protein courses, but really also kind of showcasing alternative protein as a career path and cellular agriculture as a career path that can be, a fascinating choice for someone interested in science, and potentially keep people studying science that might not have otherwise been interested in continuing in science, because maybe you don't want to do medicine or I don't know, other kind of like, biotech research. But maybe food and solving food. I mean, there's something very primal about working on the future of food that is just different than working on any other industry. And I think you and I both see this when we talk to anyone in this industry. There's just like there's hearts in their eyes, because it's just food is probably the only thing other than breathing that unites the entire world. Every one of us has to eat, no matter who we are, where we're from, what our reality is. And so I think that's quite transformative, and I think can be a real catalyst for getting people, students, younger kids involved. And when I speak to primary age kids or young secondary age kids, I can see that it really excites them in a way that, if I talked about tissue engineering, they might not be as excited. Not that I'm saying it's not super exciting to do tissue engineering. But the idea is that food really just, I don't know, it's very special.
100%. And I think the second thing that's uniting perhaps all of us or motivating all of us is just how important this mission is. And you see that in all the founders you speak to. And they're very willing to collaborate and share. They're setting up these groups. I think everyone recognizes just how important us solving for climate change is. We have had 13 million people die around the world each year due to unavoidable environmental causes. That's double what happened with COVID last year. And if we don't act, obviously it's going to get a lot worse. And I don't think it's just a matter of sustainability, but also equitability, because the more inefficient our systems are, the less unjust, unhealthy, and happy societies. Basically, we're killing people, right? This inequality, because of lack of shared resources, is killing 21,000 people a day, right? That's 1 every 4 seconds. And there's so much potential through this stack, and in terms of creating healthier, affordable, abundant, rich, healthier, I said healthier, but cruelty-free systems. And I think every founder that I speak to, or the ones that we like to back, are ones that are, really care about the category and are very passionate about it. And I'm sure you see that too, it's exciting, probably to also cover companies like this, because there's a much bigger mission in this space than almost any other category that we're in.
Exactly. Absolutely. You can feel it. It jumps off the screen, the page. Absolutely. Well, we're going to go for another 5 minutes, because so everybody, by the way, we're going a little bit over time, because apparently people want to stay with us for a little longer. Manav. So let's kind of try and final words, like predictions going forward, and specifically in Asia. Let's make some predictions. Let's Scott Galloway this. Let's not be afraid to go wrong, to be wrong.
I think at least for us, we just closed our Series B in Q4 last year. I think
Yeah, congratulations on that.
well, the work has just started now, right? So whatever we've done, we now actually have to do a lot more of it and do it in a scalable way. So it brings in a whole host of additional challenges. And I think, we've invested in a little over, 40 companies in the space. We've backed companies in plant-based, lab-grown, precision fermentation. Teams that have joined the programs have gone on to raise over $2 million post-program, which is just absolutely fantastic. We now also have some capital to start doing some direct investments. So we invested recently in $1 billion. We're excited about seeing how our entire portfolio can use $1 billion. We've invested in Good Food Tech, Jack and Brian, a number of other companies directly. So one of the things we're excited about is seeing how we can also make some additional direct investments that, for companies that are perhaps slightly later than an accelerator. We're also excited to continue to scale more accelerators around the region. So we want more opportunities to work with founders on ground in their local communities. We've always believed the founders that are the ones that are worth backing are the ones that have lived through the problem that they are solving. So, we're super excited to see how we can find more founders that are truly in the grassroots of the challenges and not only have a good background, but have seen the problem and are truly passionate about solving for it. And we're very bullish. I think there's a lot to do, but that also means there's a lot of scope for inventors and entrepreneurs to really kind of take this by the horns. Funding has grown year after year. It's only going to continue to grow. It's grown in Asia. It's growing in India. It's growing in China. We're seeing GFI and groups like yourselves doing so much great work on the exposure side and creating awareness, which is promoting through the support, more money, more resources to get in. We like to think that accelerators also help bring in groups who are not traditionally investing in this category because they allow exposure to larger family offices and funds and groups that use us as an origination funnel to find early stage companies, to curate, to do DD, to validate the teams and the business models and the potential. And hopefully we can put more of these programs on ground in many more locations so we can work with more investors as well as governments and other stakeholders. So yeah, I mean, predictions outside, I think we have a lot of work to do, but we're fairly bullish. And if I was to predict anything, I would see that one government's going to step up, or a couple governments are going to step up and say, look, we're fully behind this. We're going to back it. We're going to put more infrastructure in it. We're going to support the companies, support the teams. We're going to open up regulation. And you know what? We're going to lose some money in the process, but long term, this is the right thing to do, and it will create, a strong sovereign kind of food security. That's the hope.
I love it. Okay, I'll make some predictions. I think there could be some really, I think India is going to be one to watch, but it's probably going to take a couple of years. I think really on the cell ag side and the precision fermentation side, I'm quite bullish that there's just so much talent in India and there's some fantastic universities. And I think once they get going, they're going to be unstoppable. I really think people should be looking at Korea. It's amazing how far that ecosystem has come in just a few years, where we weren't talking at all about Korea. In fact, I think the money was, and the predictions were more on Japan, but actually Japan seems to be falling behind, and really Korea has picked up, much like on the pop cultural scene and the music scene. So I think lots to watch for there. I don't know if Cell Agri considers Israel part of the equation here of Asia, because some definitions do and some don't, but obviously Israel is an absolute must-watch country. I mean, I think they have the most number of alternative protein companies per capita and so many cell ag companies. Again, it is really heavily linked to countries where there are really strong science and tech universities. Obviously, I think Singapore will continue to be kind of the leading city in the region for the space. But I think from what I know, Hong Kong has woken up a little recently, and I think there's a lot more to come there. What I think is that there's going to be a big proliferation of new companies in the region in the next 5 years, and it's going to start competing with the number of companies globally. And I actually see in some ways Asia maybe overtaking. I'm talking more again on specifically on cell ag and fermentation, less on plant-based. And what's really interesting in Asia is that the big food groups are getting involved in cell ag much earlier than maybe they are in the US and in Europe. The big groups in US and Europe tend to be getting involved in precision fermentation and in plant-based, but here in Asia, we already have at least 2 or 3 big food players that we know of that are basically putting money aside to invest in cell ag and you know, making bridges and partnerships with some of the startups in the region. So it's pretty exciting.
Yep, 100% agree with you. And I will definitely use that as guidance to go look at Korea in more detail. And India, I think we're very bullish on. I think it's got, you know, tremendous crop diversity. It's got, you know, cost of experimentation in India is lower than anywhere else in the world. It's got a strong domestic market. It's always been a service market in the sense that if they can also build the foundation, they could export and support so many other countries. So no, it's great. Lots of scope.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think we're at time. So we're gonna give you guys a few minutes before you go to your next one. And Ahmed, I see Ahmed, you're back.